Lecture 5, U.S. Policy and Illegal Drugs. In 1936, a church group financed a film called Tell Your Children. It was a cautionary tale against the use of marijuana. The film reveals the many perils of marijuana use and addiction. It follows the story of how drug pushers convince young teenagers to use marijuana and then their ensuing demise. Sexual compromise, crime, manslaughter, insanity, etc. It's a morality tale. And so this week, I'd like you to watch just a bit or even the whole thing if you have time, so you can get a sense of the feel of the film. Now, the film itself didn't have much of a popular audience at the time. It was later recut and re-released under the title Reefer Madness. By the 1970s, it was shown in pro-pot gatherings, right, as a kind of spoof, and had quite a life on the cult cinema circuit for its unintentional comedic parts, as you'll see. But back in 1936, it certainly reflected the fears of many Americans. And one of those Americans was the chief of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotic Drugs, or BND. And that chief of the Bureau of Narcotic Drugs was Harry J. Anslinger. And he went on a crusade to get marijuana put on the growing list of illegal drugs. So much so that he actually gave a presentation before the U.S. Congress, the Committee on the Ways and Means of the U.S. Congress, about the evils of marijuana. And I want to read to you just a little bit of that exchange between Congressman and Anslinger. Mr. McCormick: what are its first manifestations? A feeling of grandeur and self-exaltation and things of that sort? Anslinger: it affects different individuals in different ways. Some individuals have a complete loss of sense of time or a sense of value. They lose their sense of place. They have an increased feeling of physical strength and power. Some people will fly into a delirious rage, and they are temporarily irresponsible and may commit violent crimes. Other people will laugh uncontrollably. It is impossible to say what the effect will be on any individual. Those research men who have tried it have always been under control. They have always insisted upon that. Mr. McCormick: is it used by the criminal class? Mr. Anslinger: yes, it is. It is dangerous to the mind and body, and particularly dangerous to the criminal type, because it releases all of the inhibitions. Mr. Reed: the testimony before the committee of which I am formally chairman, in reference to heroin, said in reference to the effect of it that it made men feel fearless, and that a great majority of the crimes of great violence that were committed by addicts. And one man stated that it would make a rabbit fight a bulldog. Does this drug have a similar effect? Mr. Anslinger: it is great. Here is a gang of 7 young men, all 7 of them young men under 21 years of age. They terrorized Central Ohio for more than 2 months, and they were responsible for 38 stick-ups. They all boast they did those crimes while under the influence of marijuana. So when you read through this testimony, and there's more, and I've put up the notes there, and you can read the rest of it, what becomes clear is that there's a lack of knowledge about the actual effects of marijuana. And Anslinger used this lack of knowledge, or these fear tactics, and the fear around marijuana usage, especially among the young, and its use to connect them to criminality. The criminal class could include, and often did include, minorities, right? This was used also to racialize the use of drugs. This testimony was important in urging Congress to pass the first federal mandate prohibiting the sale and use of marijuana. Before that time, state legislation had been put in place against marijuana, but it wasn't until the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 that the weight of the federal government was put behind stopping the so-called marijuana epidemic. Yet what is clear is that medical and psychological professionals did not agree with Anslinger, and they were not listened to. So if marijuana was not as bad as Anslinger said, why the move towards prohibition? Well, in the late 19th century, marijuana, opium, and cocaine were commonly used in Mexico and the United States, but basically for medicinal purposes. Laudanum, heroin, and other substances derived from opium, as well as marijuana cigarettes, coca wine, and cocaine, were often distributed at pharmacies. Some attempts at control of these substances happened after 1870, but these were largely unsuccessful. But the first decade of the 20th century, this began to change, and U.S. policy began to change. First, under President Theodore Roosevelt, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act was passed that required accurate labeling of patent medicines. This had a health aspect, obviously, so people would know what they were getting. No more snake oil salesmen. But it also assisted and supported larger corporations in regulating the business of medicine. So if I have a patent, then I own that product. No one else can sell it as their own. Number two, international conventions also moved U.S. policy towards the prohibition of certain kinds of medicines, which were then labeled as illegal drugs or narcotics. There was the Shanghai Conference in 1909 that helped control the trade of opium. And after that, the Harrison Act on narcotics in 1914, which became a founding rationale for expanding American policy worldwide. So what's the rationale for prohibition? Well, we'll deal with the rationale for this drug prohibition more fully in a future lecture, but it's enough to list some of the reasons. Drugs and race. Drugs in the hands of minority groups were seen as leading to crime. Drugs and morality. Drugs were seen as degrading morality. Drugs and professionalization. Drugs were seen more and more as to be distributed only through professional doctors for medical purposes, not for pleasure or recreational use. So, thus, doctors alone were the ones to give them to patients, not pharmacists or others that were non-professional. In the midst of this drive towards creating laws for the use of drugs, the importance of the temperance movement and the prohibition of alcohol is crucial to understand. Although there were dry laws that had been passed in many states, the U.S.'s entrance into World War I imbued anti-alcohol campaigns with patriotic vigor. German breweries were pegged as producing the quote-unquote Kaiser's brew. The 18th Amendment would outlaw the interstate commerce associated with alcohol, and the Volstead Act introduced enabling legislation. This is what we know as prohibition, right? Where the legal sale of alcohol couldn't go forth in the United States. Volstead was ultra-religious and touted evangelist Billy Sunday's hope that America would be so dry she could not even spit. But it had unintended consequences. The prohibition legislation had the consequence of helping the rise of the mafia and the bootlegging enterprise in the United States. And this is well known, right? We all know about Al Capone and his lot. At the same time, you can see the rise and importance of cities such as Tijuana, where alcohol moved across international borders with Mexico, where obviously in Mexico alcohol wasn't illegal. But even after the repeal of prohibition in the 1930s, the production and shipment of opium continued, as we spoke about last time. Poppy culture had existed in Mexico since the last quarter of the 1800s, especially in the state of Sinaloa in northwestern Mexico. There were early efforts within Mexico to prohibit drugs during the years of the Mexican Revolution. Some Mexican politicians sought restrictions on opium, morphine, ether, cocaine, and marijuana. The rationale was that this was selling substances which poison the individual and degenerate the Mexican race. But this concern was more about public health than about destroying revenue from the trade. Early trafficking was run mainly through Mexicali in Baja California and was protected by Colonel Esteban Cantu in the state of Baja California, who was the governor of that state from 1916 to 1920. Marijuana commercialization was officially prohibited in 1920, and poppy production was prohibited in 1926. At this time, coca production didn't exist in Mexico. But after this time, smuggling efforts in the black market increased in such states as Puebla, Guerrero, Tlaxcala, as well as through the border areas of Nogales, Mexicali, and Ciudad Juarez. Moreover, Mexicans began to take over the trade from Chinese traffickers. As Grillo explains, anti-immigrant and anti-Chinese sentiment was high in Mexico at the time. During this period from the 1920s to the 1940s, many of the restrictions were not followed. This depended on the state governor in question. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, which was originally established in 1929 as the National Revolutionary Party, then reformed in the 1930s as the Party of the Mexican Revolution, then finally in the 1940s as the PRI, gained loyalty from state governors by giving them autonomy on the drug issue. Right? Their success or failure depended on the state. There were rules of the game that drug traffickers played by. The drug traffickers did not mess with the hierarchy of the police and were not to use the city as battlefields against rival cartels. One note, a good example is found in the state of Sinaloa. Agricultural products were sold along with poppies in Sinaloa since the late 19th century when it was legal. After prohibition, some wealthy families, peasants, adventurers, middle-class people, they continued in the sale of poppies and opium. The small town of Badiraguato was an important center for this. Most people knew each other. Family ties went deep. This helped reduce violence as the drug trade was an equal opportunity sort of business. The illegal trade needed the legal economy that surrounded it. Family dynasties were created that passed on knowledge to successive generations. Drug trafficking at the time was not political per se, but it stayed within certain boundaries. By the late 1950s, the term narco-trafficker begins to be used instead of the term gomero, or the gummers, the poppy growers. In the 1950s, attempts at eradication simply moved the trade to other states, such as Jalisco, Nayarit, and Michoacan. In the 1960s, with the counterculture going on around the world, there was a demand for pot and heroin from American soldiers and students that caused a marked increase in the trade. In 1966, U.S. authorities destroyed in just 45 days 3,000 tons of marijuana. And then we have a crucial watershed. In 1969, President Nixon launches Operation Intercept. It's one of the first major policies of the U.S. government to stop the drugs at the border. And it's the beginning of a new type of U.S. policy. The marijuana trade created new fortunes and much quicker. The earlier generation with its unwritten codes began to be broken by more individuals in more places. By mid-1970s, the Mexican government unleashed its own bold program called Operation Condor. 10,000 troops were sent to eradicate the trade in illegal narcotics and marijuana. Hundreds of peasants had to leave Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango, and drug traffickers were not captured. But it did unleash abuses by the military and human rights violations on average citizens. And it served to degrade the opinion that average Mexican citizens had against the military. Then in the mid-1980s, an important incident took place when a DEA agent, Department of drug enforcement agent named Enrique Camarena was killed in Mexico along with his Mexican pilot. This took place after a huge marijuana plantation in Chihuahua was discovered that was reputedly owned by the drug trafficker Rafael Caro Quintero. Both Camarena and his pilot were found dead in the Mexican state of Michoacan. The importance of this affair was that for the first time, American anti-narcotics agents began to openly talk about the special relationship that existed between the drug traffickers and important political institutions and politicians. The drug war that continued during the 1980s and during the presidency of George H.W. Bush only further inflamed tensions between Mexico and the United States and increased the price of drugs at the street level. Despite this, demand did not drop significantly. So, despite all of the increased efforts at interdicting drugs at the border in 1969, or the Mexican government trying to stamp out the drug cartels in the 1970s, or in the 1980s, increased vigilance by the U.S. government after the death of the DEA agent Enrique Camarena, all of this didn't really significantly stop demand for drugs in the United States. So what we want to think about here is, when we know and begin to understand the history of U.S. drug enforcement and the fact that it didn't have really any kind of effect on the demand for the drugs and only made drugs more profitable and therefore more enticing for people to go into the drug trade, what exactly is the benefit of continuing this kind of U.S. policy? So that's what we'll tackle in the coming sessions. Thanks. That's all I have for you today.